Welcome to Geer Cemetery, one of Durham's African American historic cemeteries, founded about 1877. When this land was purchased by three African American men from Jesse Geer and his wife, this was farmland. It was open land. Houses were not here. Cars were not here. It was in the middle of nowhere. And these three African American men who at one time been enslaved purchased this land as a burial ground for the African Americans that were moving to Durham. The African American community was growing because of the textile industry and because of the tobacco industry. They were leaving the farm. They were coming in looking for a better life, more economic power, which they were finding in Durham, but they needed a burial place. There was no community burial place for African Americans. There was a cemetery in Durham, but they were not allowed to be buried there. So we have in Geer Cemetery, we have prominent people, we have everyday people, we have the children who didn't make it to adulthood. We have educators, we have ministers, we have entrepreneurs, we have the people who filled the infrastructure type jobs, the cooks, the drivers, the porters, all of those buried here in Geer Cemetery. The Friends of Geer Cemetery started as a grassroots organization about 20 years ago. And it had its ups and downs, and last year it finally was incorporated as a 501c3. And our purpose is not just the grounds, as you could see, could use some work, and a lot has happened here, but it's also in preserving the legacy, the history of the people who are buried in the cemetery. We are here today to kick off an exhibit about the cemetery and about the people that are here.
In Plain Sight is a continuation of the work that the descendants and activists that form the Friends of Geer Cemetery have been doing for years, but it's also very much a product of our particular time. Just within the year 2020, we had the city of Durham re-engage with the perpetual care necessary to preserve this space. We had national protests over the killing of George Floyd and the questions that it raises about long-standing injustice that continues to this day. And of course, we had the coronavirus pandemic that made community organizing extremely difficult, made it very hard for the Friends of Geer Cemetery, like a lot of other community-based organizations, to continue to gather people around the cause. And it was in that context that we applied for and received grant support from the North Carolina Humanities Council, which began to make In Plain Sight a reality. From there, we had the support of more than 100 donors and volunteers who poured in thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours of volunteer work to do the research, the writing, the editing, and the outreach work that is part of this effort. We're particularly grateful for the active participation of many descendants of those buried here in Geer Cemetery. Without them, and without the stories that they've helped us reconstruct, it'd be very difficult to bring some of the life that this exhibit shares to those of you who will come and see it. We're grateful in particular for them sharing personal artifacts and photos that really give us a window into the lives of those who've gone before us here in Durham. The exhibit itself, which will be up for the next 6 weeks here along the historic carriage track through Geer Cemetery, features both the history of the space itself and some of the stories of the lives of those who are laid to rest here. Through the stories of those lives, it's also a story about the history of Durham's African American community. And through the contributions that those people and that community made, it's really a story about the history of Durham altogether. The recent report of the City of Durham's Racial Equity Task Force emphasized visibility as a major issue in the ways in which historical injustice is perpetuated in our present and will be into our future. The exhibit here at Geer Cemetery is really about laying open questions that have been a part of our past and that if we don't address, if we don't appreciate the contributions that have been made, and if we don't discuss the ways in which those contributions have been downplayed, we risk perpetuating problems that have been part of our city for way too long. The panels that make up this outdoor exhibit focus on aspects of Durham history told through the lives of those buried here. An important part of that story is the experience of new life after emancipation. Among others, our Out of Slavery panel shares the story of John Wesley Geer.
John Wesley Geer is his mother was a slave, and his father was the son of Jesse Geer, who sold this land to 3 African American men to start the cemetery. So he is actually, his last name Geer, he is tied to Geer Plantation. He's my paternal great-grandfather, and we're not exactly sure where he's buried in the cemetery, but he appears on the list, the city list, and we know that he's here. My grandmother told me about him. He is my grandmother's father, and she was the one that told me where he was buried, that he was here in the cemetery. My family's roots run deep in Durham, and through the researchers with Geer Cemetery, I have found that my family's roots run deep in Geer Cemetery. I have relatives on both sides, my mother's side and my father's side, who are buried here. The first time I actually saw the cemetery was when I was a young girl, riding with my grandfather, and we passed by the cemetery, and we didn't even know it was a cemetery because it was overgrown. There were so many leaves, and trees were overgrown, poison ivy, vines. You couldn't see the markers, the grave markers. And he just told us, you have cousins up in there. And we thought, oh my gosh, we have cousins that are living in the woods over there. And I found out later that no, there was a cemetery there. So that was my first connection with this cemetery. And then later, of course, after my grandmother told me about her father being buried here, it was because of my father and my grandmother that I decided to join this, because my grandmother didn't really know her father that well. So when I heard about the Friends of Geer organizing years ago in the early 2000s, I decided that I wanted to become a member and see what I could find out about my great-grandfather. We had this picture, but we didn't know much about him. You know, I think it's a wonderful place for descendants and for other African Americans who to find out more about their history, about their genealogy. Everyone usually, I think, has a curiosity about where they come from, and the people here that are buried here, I think we were their future. You know, when they passed, when they were alive, they actually wanted to do better. They wanted their other generations ahead of them to do better. They wanted the hard work that they did to show up later on in, you know, their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. And I think that because of that, it's important that we not forget them, that we honor them, that we honor the work that they did, and that we try to fulfill the dreams that they had. We've done, a lot of work to get the cemetery to this place where it is now, so that you can at least see far back into the back part of the cemetery, because at the very beginning you couldn't even see past a lot of these trees, and now at least the trail is clear, the carriage road is clear, and you can walk along the carriage road. I would love to be able to see more benches. I would love for us to be able to find and, you know, possibly fix more headstones, and maybe have flowers planted, you know, just a place for others who don't live in Durham, or those who do live in Durham, you know, to come and say, well, this is where my ancestor is buried, and a place of reflection.
Churches have been pillars of African American life in Durham, and many of their founders and members are buried in Geer. Among those featured in the exhibit's Faith Communities section is Margaret Ruffin Fawcett.
Well, my husband and I were married many, many years, and we dated for many years before we were married, and I visited Durham quite often, and we would go to White Rock Baptist Church, and he and my future mother-in-law at that time would tell me about Margaret Fawcett. Margaret Ruffin Fawcett was born in 1822, and she was a woman of faith. She was a former slave, and she was a very religious person. She taught herself to read, and she was the person who gathered a small group of people together, and they planted the seed and formed White Rock Baptist Church. Margaret Fawcett was the mother of many children. I think it was 12, I'm not sure. I think it was 12 children. And we have in our home a picture of 5 generations of women where she is the oldest on the picture, and then her daughter, and then her daughter, and then her daughter. And the last one is a baby who was my mother-in-law. And that's a picture that we all treasure. In 1966, White Rock Baptist Church celebrated their centennial, and they had a program for which my husband had a copy of that I shared with Friends of Geer. And it's very fascinating because it lists so much about her and her children, her grandchildren, her descendants. Before Kelly Bryant died, he spoke to my husband, who was his cousin, of course, about Geer Cemetery, and told him that their relative, that Margaret Fawcett, was buried there. And it became one of those things that my husband was determined to find her headstone, which of course he never did before he died. But he would be delighted, as Kelly would be, that it was eventually found. I was told by Kelly Bryant's sister, Maggie Bryant, that the headstone had been found. And I went over with a friend and we tried to find it. And we could not find it initially. But as we were leaving, after we had said, well, we can't find it, it had started to rain. As we were leaving, I looked over and I saw it, and I just screamed. I was so happy to see it. We got out of the car. I got out of the car and took pictures of it and shared it with my children and grandchildren. In 2019, my husband and I came to the cemetery for an event. And he was so overwhelmed with emotion at that time, and so committed and dedicated to seeing it become not so much of an eyesore as it was then. It had been years past, just a really badly kept. So when we were at that event in June, he was very happy to be there, and we were just fascinated. And as I said, we would love to see Geer. It's so much history there, and I think that's what he said. He was featured on the news at night on TV, and that was probably one of the last times he was able to really be out and about. And he spoke then and said that the Geer Cemetery had so much history there because so many movers and shakers were buried there, and that's absolutely true. We need to let it be known the importance of these people who are buried here, who were mostly forgotten, and as there are other Black cemeteries all over the country that I'm hearing from other people who are calling me or texting me and telling me that they have similar cemeteries in their hometowns and they would like to help to get those going too. Maybe Geer Cemetery can become some sort of a model for other cities to we could at least help other cities get those cemeteries up to par.
Another portion of the exhibit focuses on the contributions those buried in Geer Cemetery made to the economic life of Durham in their day. One person featured is Thomas J. Goodloe.
I recall coming to Geer Cemetery for the very first time in 2014, and I walked through the marshes and everything, and I actually walked through with sandals, and it was in the summer, so what the heck was I thinking, right? But I was just so excited, and I was in search of finding my Goodloe ancestors, and I was able to find Louis Goodloe, who was the father of Thomas J. Goodloe. And what's interesting about that is that Louis Goodloe and my third great-grandfather, Daniel Goodloe, were brothers who married sisters, Harriet Justice and Maria Justice. Thomas J. Goodloe's mother was Harriet Justice, and I descend from Maria Justice. And so it's really, really interesting because Thomas J. Goodloe, for me, is so emblematic of what it meant to strive and to thrive in Durham's Hayti Black Wall Street community. And so his contributions to the community really are far-reaching. And so he was able to not only be a part of the launching effort of North Carolina Mutual, which got its start in 1898. Thomas J. Goodloe was a part of that. And so he was able to grow and mature in his career there. And with the mentorship of John Merrick and Charles C. Spalding and Dr. Erin McDuffie Moore and P.W. Dawkins and others, he was able to really rise to great heights within that organization. But I'm convinced from my research that his ability to endure and to really grow and learn everything he possibly could really laid the foundation for him to branch out eventually on his own. And so that's why he was able to launch his own mattress company. And it was called the Durham Elite Mattress and Upholstery Company. And it was just marvelous that he was able to really accomplish such great feats in this business endeavor. He employed family members, so there were other Goodloes who were working to support this business venture. But he was just someone that was able to affect change in his community. In fact, W. Du Bois wrote in an early 20th century article that you can come to Durham's Hayti and you can find a mattress, that's produced by an African American, and you can, get a chair made, and what have you. And so it just made me feel good that such great iconic leaders like W. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington were able to reference these business endeavors that my family was a part of. Because it wasn't just T.J. Goodloe, but there were other relatives who were grocers and who were carpenters, and we lived on Glen Street. And so all of this really kind of ties into the information that was conveyed in the family history documents that I had received in 2011. And so it's just an honor. And so I think today, with historic cemeteries like Geer Cemetery, I think it deserves to be preserved. It deserves the stories that are in this cemetery deserves a chance to be heard and to really be treasured. Because Hayti was created to endure. The spirit of Hayti it should endure.
Much of the hard work done by African Americans in Durham happened behind the scenes of white institutions or in the homes of wealthy families. Stories of these essential workers are shared in this exhibit, including that of William Henry Shearin.
We were always told he was born in Macon, North Carolina. There is a Shearin plantation that still exists there. And he moved to Durham, I'm not sure when, and he was the butler for the Duke family. And he had, my father was his second son. He had an older son, Alexander Moore, and a daughter, Annie Brown. From the stories that my dad has told me, because I never met either one of them, Gussie died when my dad was 13, and his father died long before I was born. But from what I can understand, listening to him, as long as he worked for the Duke family, they lived pretty well. He had his own home, and the kids. There's a picture of my dad riding a tricycle or standing near a tricycle. There's the picture of the house. So they lived pretty well. And according to my dad, the Duke family wanted to make sure, as long as he worked for them, that they got whatever was comparable for Black people in Durham. It was very important that they did have an education, and all of the siblings have all gone to college, the ones who are still, who survived to adulthood. My father's oldest brother, he was the first one to go to Wilberforce. It was time for my dad to go to college. He also went to Wilberforce. Education was very important to them. It started mainly growing up with stories that my dad would tell about his father, and I seem to think he may have been on a little strict at times. And then I listened but as a child, some things you listen to and some things you just say, okay, Dad, if you say so. But then as I got older, I started wondering, well, I knew that his mother had died at an early age. He never, he says, yes, I was only 11 when my mother died. And it wasn't until a few years ago that her gravestone showed up in one of my cousins in, I think she was living in South Carolina at the time, found a picture of her gravestone in Geer Cemetery. And that's actually when I started trying to find out information more that I knew. This is the Bible that I picked up a lot of information from. And I wish I could, in fact, I took this Bible to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC, along with some other family photos. They had a day where you could bring family artifacts in, and they took a look at it. And a lot of people were fascinated by the Bible and some of the pictures. And they actually gave me, because they gave me this box to keep the Bible in, because it was, they didn't want it to get any worse off than what it is. When they had a ceremony at Geer, and my oldest daughter and I went to that ceremony, and I was able to put flowers on my grandmother's grave, because I was just so overwhelmed with joy that's where now I know that I have some history in Durham, and I can always I can leave that on, my children can know that if they want to, that's where they can go and just carry on.
Thank you all for attending the virtual opening of In Plain Sight. The exhibit is running through March 7th. There's a couple of upcoming events that we would love for you to attend, such as small group in-person tours in the cemetery. There's a virtual tour, and there's also a virtual panel discussion on February 20th. We'd love to see you come to any number of these events and hope you stay informed. Thank you.